Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. I'd like to ask leave of the senior monks, the samaneras, nagarkas, of the laity, to say some words on Dhamma. Ajahn Kachana. Oh my gosh. Ajahn Kachana asked me to talk tonight, I think, as a follow-up to Tan Kovilo's speech about 1 week ago. Tan Kovilo, the monk sitting next to me to my left, and I went on a walkabout, a pilgrimage, in our tradition referred to as Tudong, for about 7 days, ending a week ago. So we started down a little bit south of Healdsburg, around 70 miles south of Abhayagiri, and over the course of about 6 or 7 days just walked back up here, camping various places and going for alms in pretty much any small town or place that we could. And Tan Kovilo gave a really good rundown of the experience I felt last week, and spoke to some of the highlights or climaxes, such as at 11:49 and 45 seconds, after having not eaten very much the previous day, finding ourselves with about 15 seconds to eat and half a pack of Nutter Butters and just no way to make our way all the way through it, and some other things such as the just more days of scarcity a bit, where we didn't get quite as many alms as we would have thought. But overall it was a really, really good experience. And for those who don't know as much about this practice of Tudong, it's, as Tan Kovilo said last week, the Thai word Tudong comes from the Pali Dutanga, which are officially a set of 13 different practices, ascetic practices such as dwelling under the foot of trees and wearing rag robes, accepting and eating only what one receives an alms round, staying up all night, meditating, things like this. But in Thailand, it's come to have the more broad meaning of a period of walkabout or pilgrimage. And it's a quintessential part of our Thai forest tradition. In the early 1900s, it was Tudong, or monks basically shedding a bloated monastic establishment and following the Buddha's footsteps back into the forest, into sort of the arid forests of Isan in northeast Thailand and the hills of Chiang Mai, and distancing themselves from the monastic and institutional structures which had really grown and tried to get back to the essential teaching of the Buddha in the forest. And this has been a pattern throughout Buddhist history. The sasana, or the dispensation, grows, becomes prosperous, becomes more corrupt and dilute, and then a splinter leaves and returns to the way of living that the Buddha so praised, which was basically dwelling under the foot of trees, meditating in the forest. And in Thailand, during the last century, the monk who epitomized this splinter movement was Longpo Mun, whose stern picture you can see in the opposite Dhamma hall, the eating hall, I believe on the left-hand side. And he, in the first half of the 1900s, was inspired by sort of a group of wandering monks that had begun to search for or return to the meditation practice as the focus of their holy life by returning into the forest and leaving the monasteries behind. And his practice led him to rediscover liberation, which at that time in Thailand was considered as something that only monks and practitioners in the Buddhist time 2,500 years ago could have hoped to attain, and that was far beyond the abilities of anyone in this day and age. But Longpo Mun's bravery in basically not accepting that verdict and searching for liberation himself was what led him to, by all accounts, find that liberation of mind and heart, and return to Thai society later and basically teach a huge number of disciples who, by all accounts, also attained to Nibbana and ushered in a spring of faith in Thailand, whose long summer we now find ourselves in. Longpo Mun was the teacher of Ajahn Chah, and our tradition springs directly from his footsteps into the forest. So, this practice of Tudong has been something that a lot of the monasteries and monks in the West have been trying out little by little. Ajahn Yanako has done at least one month-long Tudong and several shorter ones up along the coast. There was a monk in our tradition who recently spent 3 years continuously on Tudong in the East Coast, braving really harsh conditions. But the surprising thing is that it seems to work. And this is especially surprising when you consider that when the Buddha created an institution he hoped to carry on his teachings for millennia, he made it just about as impractical as you could think to make it. He prevented us from handling money, from storing food, from asking for anything except for water, and driving, growing our own food, storing food more than one day. Basically, the idea is that in some ways the sasana, or the sangha of monks, has to be is made completely helpless and dependent materially on the generosity of strangers, the unsolicited generosity of strangers. And yet, despite what seems completely impractical on the surface, the Buddhist Sangha, with the exception maybe of the Jain monastic order, is the oldest continuous institution of humanity, which speaks a great deal to the quality of generosity which underlies human society and the human spirit. So as Tan Kovilo already spoke about our Tudong in detail, I thought maybe I would take this chance to share stories of a different Tudong I took in Australia about 2 years ago, outside of Sydney, for 7 days as well. And I had ordained in Thailand, I believe 3 years previously, and then spent the Rains retreat in Sydney at a small monastery called Bodhisattva. And another monk named Tan Adrian and I decided that after the Vasa, the 3 months Rains retreat, was finished, we wanted to go out and see if we could also basically embark on this practice of wandering Tudong. So we got all our gear together, and I think it was maybe early October, we set out on the highway leading away from Bodhisattva with a vague plan to go through a few small suburban towns and end up in a national park for the last 2 days. So it's been a long time, and I've written about it, so some of the phrases I use might be from that. I don't actually remember it perfectly anymore, and some of the names might be pseudonyms. But we hiked all day and or walked all day along the freeway, and then came to basically it was we'd been walking a long way, maybe 16 miles by the end of the day, and rain clouds were building on the horizon, and this sort of truck pulls up, and this man gets out with his young son, and they he sort of talks about how his son has been into karate all these days, and that we must be pretty familiar with that, being from Asia or something like that. And then comments about, has us take a picture with his son, and then comments how it looks like it's about to rain, and then they drive off. So we're back alone on the freeway or the highway, walking into the dark rain clouds. And then an ambulance pulls up, and a woman named Diane, or something like that, gets out and invites us into the back of her ambulance she offers us a place to stay the night. So we weren't looking forward to camping out in the rain that night, so we jumped in, which effectively meant we spent the first night of our Tudong, and ended in an ambulance. But we got to her house, and she put us up in a shed outside, and just a lot of spontaneous kindness out of nowhere. The next day, walking, we were in sort of urban Australia, walking past house after house with "Do not enter" signs and "Beware of dogs." And then somewhere in there, a house with we came across a sign that said in huge lettering, "Ashram, Yogis welcome." And when karma kind of wanders into your path like that, you take it up. So we went in and met a lot of nice people, and they fed us the meal. The next few hours we walked along an extremely narrow road, and we're just about to kind of run out of energy when this man with a mullet in a battered white Commodore, which is a Australian car, pulls up and offers us a ride. And he's talking to us as we're sitting in his car, and he's like, "Yeah, I was driving along the road, and I saw you two walking," and I was like, "What's that?" And so I pulled over, and I don't know if you guys where you guys are going, but I'll give you guys a steak dinner, wherever. And also, I've always wondered, can you guys have sex? So we had to tell them, no, we didn't. Not only could we not eat dinner, but also monastics, and don't participate in any things like that. And he was sort of asking questions just about our life and all that, and really interested and kind. And the whole experience of Tudong in Australia kind of had that same quality of a lot of spontaneous kindness out of the woodwork, from people who really didn't know what we were. And the whole experience of it relates a lot to the one part of our Tudong here that Tan Kovilo didn't get a chance to go into, which was our stay at City of 10,000 Buddhas, a Chinese Mahayana monastery just to the south of us, near Ukiah, whose teacher and progenitor, Master Hua, was responsible for offering all the land that Abhayagiri is on as a gift to our Sangha. And we'd been, I think it was the second or third to last day, and we'd been walking. It was a long day, Tan Kovilo, and I had been walking, and it was about a 20-mile day, and we were walking well past dark and got to the monastery at about 7:30 p.m. and they really welcomed us in, and we got to join in their chanting and all that. But the next day we got to sit in on a few of the classes of DRBU, Dharma Realm Buddhist University, and it was a newly accredited university, and after sitting in a few of the classes, we got a chance to have tea with the faculty and a lot of the students from there. And they were asking about what to tell people when they asked what made DRBU a Buddhist university as opposed to others. And we spoke a bit to what Ajahn Amaro, Longpo Amaro, had said the previous week when he had visited City of 10,000 Buddhas, in that our society seems to know very well what is wrong in some ways, where we have a extremely detailed picture of our suffering. And for example, one of the classes we sat in was a presentation of various students' papers, and a lot of them were presenting on a psychologist related to Freud who was speaking about the developmental stage where a child, it's called the mirror stage, where a child sees themselves in a mirror and begins to conceptualize themselves as an independent entity, and basically that small division in consciousness between self and self as object, as sort of conceiving of a self in this image in the mirror, leads to this whole proliferation and endemic alienation, which the individual spends the rest of their life trying and failing to resolve, seeing themselves reflected in not just mirrors but in the eyes of others, always wanting to make that reflection perfect, and always failing to. And Ajahn Amaro had spoken actually about Freud the previous week, saying that at the end of one of Freud's works, he says, the best I can do is change your neurotic misery into ordinary human unhappiness. So I thought that was a very interesting statement and fairly apt in that it acknowledges, and Longpo Amaro also referenced how the DSM, the manual which a lot of psychologists use to diagnose various kinds of neuroses, is almost completely dedicated to various kinds of psychosis and problems that the mind has, and has, the previous edition, I think he said, only had about 15 pages dedicated to like mental well-being, what a healthy mind and spirit looks like. And Longpo Amaro had spoken about how this was the gift that Buddhism can give the world, is that in Buddhism there is a extremely detailed and fleshed out view of what the mind can become. We have, in terms of its good qualities, of what a healthy mind looks like, and not just the healthy heart and mind that I think most of us as Westerners have some vague idea of, but something that can only maybe be called saintliness in our vernacular. A completely pure heart. The different lists that the Buddha gave us to delineate these mental qualities, like the 7 factors of awakening, the basis of power, speaking to mental qualities like rapture, joy, unification of mind, things like this, and how all of these qualities gather with careful cultivation to issue into liberation of the heart. And that, I think, was what could make DRBU, this new university, a really a quintessentially Buddhist university, was the fact that it has the missing element of the escape from all this suffering, which we've mapped out so well in our culture through Freud, etc. But we forgot the essential element of what do we do about that, other than sort of floundered it more and more. And I found it very heartening at the end of that class on Freud, how the teacher, Doug Powers, spoke to how when we know the way that we alienate ourselves, whether through, echoes of this whole mirror stage and various other ways we alienate and cause suffering, how it's not that you have to untangle the whole thing or stop the whole process, but just gaining a little bit of distance from it and knowing it, that's enough to really make an enormous amount of difference. And that was this element I've never seen brought into the study of all these things in our Western heritage, was this essential Buddhist insight into the escape. So all this relates to Tudong in that I feel that the practice of Tudong is, and what the Buddha established the monastic order in its utter helplessness materially to in part represent, is the quality of goodness that underlies our lives and truly nourishes them, but that we so frequently don't see, acknowledge, or call out. And just as in our intellectual landscape of colleges, etc., we become so fixated on the different ways that the self has developed into neuroses, so in our lives and culture, we so frequently focus on the various problems we have, on the latest headlines, which only discourage us, on the more coarse events and relationships and rivalries and ambitions and jealousies in our lives. These begin to take up a huge amount of space over time. And to put it simply, even though I think we've, as a culture, done a pretty good job of exiling the three heavenly messengers of old age, sickness, and death to hospitals, old folks' homes, various places where they don't really have to confront us, the truth of dukkha is still insidiously and pervasively wound into our lives in various ways. And I think a lot of us sense that suffering and don't know what to do about it, because the fourth messenger of the renunciant is missing. And this is what I think that Tudong and renunciants in a culture have can truly do, is that wandering on Tudong and going to various small towns and really standing near shops hoping that people might spontaneously offer something for you to eat. Most of the people that we run into don't know what we are. They haven't ever met a Buddhist monk before. And yet there's an intuitive draw and faith that comes just from seeing someone who has dedicated themselves to a spiritual path. And I think that's very heartening for people, some people. And I think that our culture as a whole is extremely hungry for that figure of the fourth messenger of the renunciant, for that signpost. Because what the monastic code and the Vinaya forces the Buddhist monk to do is rely on nothing more than that goodness that exists throughout the world, and by giving up all means of supporting oneself materially independently, it's all those acts of renunciation are really an enormous act of affirmation that with purity of heart, practice, and purpose, the world will carry you and will hold you, and that this goodness pervades the world, and yet we miss it constantly because we are so fixated on the various sufferings in our lives. The monk I went on Tudong with in Australia told me about a dream he had before we went on Tudong. And he was jumping off of a high building and jumped off basically, and then pulled a parachute and floated down to the ground. And then next he went several floors down and jumped off again, pulled his parachute, and it barely managed to get out and slow him down before he hit the ground much harder. And then the last time he went a few floors even more down and jumped off, and the parachute didn't open almost at all, and like he hit the pavement really hard and woke up. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor for what Tudong is supposed to be, is that sometimes the only way to get a feel for and affirm faith in the goodness of the world is to take the bigger leap, and that's actually safer sometimes. And I think that this is the beauty of community, of the teaching, of spiritual friendships, of the examples of great teachers, of the examples of the Sangha, is that it gives us the faith to take that step, to take that leap into practice and trust that there will be something there to hold us. And I don't think that simply applies to monastics going forth, but to lay people in their everyday lives. I think there's a huge amount which is we do, which is completely contrary to common perception and cultural norms. And it's not easy to take that leap of faith and do it, because it's not immediately apparent why that will be helpful or what it will lead to. Most people here just took the 8 precepts, and I think a lot of our culture would look at those as extremely, constraining, as contrary to what we should have or focus on as human beings. Our Puritan roots and the backlash against that really dictates that anything looked as a precept or moral restraint in this way can come away with a really bad taste to the average Western mouth. But if we see that each of these renunciations is really an affirmation of something deeper, then they take on a new quality. And by seeing that others around us have taken on similar restraints to their external freedoms, and that's actually led to an immense amount of internal freedom and well-being, then we can gain the courage and the determination to actually go ahead and take on practices which don't make a lot of sense to American culture. Yes, we do give up taking life, but if you do that long enough, you begin to see a natural, deep love of the, beings around you grow stronger just from that refraining. And I think the thing is that when the Buddha did speak about what we approach when we give up all these things, he said it was subtle. And I think in our gluttony for the world, we can forget or miss the taste of that subtle happiness, which is the taste of Dhamma. And in the first phrases of the Dhammapada, the Buddha speaks about suffering following the ill-directed mind, like the hoof or like a wheel follows the ox, whereas happiness follows the well-directed mind like a shadow that never leaves. And you think about those two images and how solid and coarse and easy to pinpoint the hoof and the wheel are, but how the happiness, it's subtler, it's the shadow. And I think this is why the fourth messenger is so important, is because it's an affirmation of something much, much more subtle, and why our practice also requires a certain amount of faith, because we're walking into a type of happiness and well-being which is so different than our normal way of orienting that we can really miss it, and it can feel completely disorienting at first. The happiness of being blameless, the happiness of, not going out with friends and sitting meditation instead. I mean, these are not things that immediately jump out, but if practiced over time, the sense of well-being is profound and deeply meaningful. So I think that for me, this is the beauty of Tudong, is that it forces you not only to, for a time serve as that fourth messenger, as a monastic in a society where I think that is valuable, but also really to affirm your faith and surrender to that goodness which underlies so much and which you can miss if you don't every now and again take the leap from the higher floor and see that again and again it does catch you. And yeah, there was one day where Tan Kovilo and I, got a half pack of Rolos each and a piece of puffy bread and half a Pepsi, for our meal, but only one. And the other days we were extremely well cared for. And even that day, we were actually, the kindness of the people who gave that was enough for us to feel pretty good. And even in a culture that does not know monastics, the goodness and the way the world responds to purity of heart and intention is reliable, and it's enough. And it can guide us over time, but it's, I also think, a quiet and a subtle voice that we need to learn to listen to. And that's part of the reason why I think taking on moral restraint and also a daily practice of sitting in silence is so important, is that it lets us hear the cricket on Pinocchio's book, that tells him to open it, or those quieter voices that say the most important things. To apply this practically on the microcosmic or internal level of meditation, to get away from a fairly abstract thought, I think that when the mind begins to grow quiet, there really can be this sense of disorientation. All the ways we usually orient ourselves internally, either in the body, I think if you sort of develop a full bodied awareness of the breath, you see how various thoughts create knots or small sensations around the body, like fear, a knot in the stomach, maybe the sense of self and the observer is located in the middle of the head. or just the way we orient around various fantasies and things, the argument you've had with your roommate, 7 times in the last hour, and just keep going back to, because somehow it provides a bit of, it orients you a bit. And as meditation progresses and things grow calmer, and the external sense of the breath fades, and those internal knots of tension relax, the mind can at first be very disoriented and not really know where to go, and it can actually be frightening and just difficult to know what to do with that. And I find that when the mind becomes subtle like that, it's very helpful to let it expand out and really turn attention to the fact that what appears sort of empty because we're so unused to looking at it, just as walking out of the monastery into rural Sonoma County could seem like there's just not much there that's going to sustain you in terms of alms or places to rest, etc. But then you find there's actually a lot there. And there's this great kindness holding everything. That similarly, when the mind relaxes into that and you drop a small perception into that subtle, expansive space in the mind, like a small thought of metta or a perception of light, that the mind responds very immediately, and that emptiness becomes a bit of a doorway, and and brightens, and you find that what you thought really felt empty and disorienting, with a little bit of invitation and a little bit of careful application of effort and perception, can become not just enough to hold you, but extremely beautiful and pure, and a really wonderful abiding place. I think that's why in the first 2 tetrads of the Anapanasati Sutta, there's these steps about relaxing various formations, the bodily formation and the mental formations. But then you get to the 3rd tetrad, where it speaks about becoming sensitive to the mind as a whole. And then it doesn't speak about, in the 3rd tetrad, relaxing formations, because I think the sense is that you are to that space already where the mind is relaxed and spread out, and those knots have been also unwound. So in the 3rd tetrad, there's no, doesn't follow the usual pattern of becoming sensitive to a mental or bodily formation and then relaxing it. Rather, you simply become sensitive to the mind, and then you immediately move to gladdening the mind, concentrating the mind, liberating the mind. And I take that to mean that when you let the mind relax into that large space internally, that if you acknowledge or invite or see the subtle quality of goodness and brightness and purity that actually pervades that space that you were missing because you were so focused on the various knots and sensations and fantasies and more solid things, that it really that it brightens very quickly. And I think that relates to this whole experience of walking, in that I think the real importance of Tudong is just that, is seeing that all the things you considered essential and have become so fixated on, when you put them aside and really put your faith in a goodness that seems to pervade things and support things, but that most people really miss because we're too busy and moving too fast, and we're focused on the next thing. That when you slow down and walk into that and entrust yourself completely to that it's enough, and that actually is a great deal there, if you only allow yourself to rest in it. But that sometimes that takes a certain amount of throwing yourself into it. So this may have been a bit scattered, but it is what it was. So that's all I have to say today.